In the previous video, we took a look at strings in Java and how we can take different strings, add them together, and derive brand new strings and store those as variables. We also took a look briefly at Java's ability to store numbers as strings. Now, let me just delete these here. And I'm going to create I'm going to rename this to number1. I'm going to create a new string variable, and I'm going to call it number2, and I'm going to set that equal to 1. Actually, I'm going to do 100 and 100, just to make it a little neater. And I'm going to do the same thing we did earlier. I'm going to try to concatenate these two values and see what I end up with. So I'm just going to do that here. So I'm going to add number1 plus number2. I'm going to run that, and I'm going to see what happens. So I end up with the value 100, 100, or 100 and 100. So what happened here? So we took the value of our first string, which is named number1, and contains a value of 100. And I took a second variable, also type string, called number2, which also contains a value of 100. And so what happened here was the same thing that happens when I have two strings, one for John and one for Doe. When I add them together, they end up mushed together. So if you're doing any math calculations, if you're looking to add numbers, strings are not the data type you'll want to use. Strings should only be used when you want to store variables or values that are meant to be represented in a text format. Numbers can be represented in a text format, but you can't add anything onto them. You can't add them to other numbers the same way you might in your math class, right? So what you can do, though, is maybe say, I don't know, Larry had 100 horses in his ranch. I don't know. You can store that as a string, right? And that would run. But again, the point is what you're actually storing here is represented as text. It's not numerical. So this number here, this 100 here, and this 100 there, they're not numbers. They're just text representations of numbers. All right, so we have our output here. Again, there are two concatenated string variables, string values. Larry had 100 horses in his ranch, plus the string text 100 results in this. Okay, so what if we do actually want to work with numbers? What if we actually want to store numerical values into our variables? Well, Java has another data type called int that takes care of that. So instead of using the string attribute or the string data type, we'll replace that with int, int, and that's short for integer. So what I'll do here is I'll define a new variable. And again, a variable always has three components to it. So I need to specify the data type. In this case, we're moving on to int. I need to give my variable a name. In this case, I'm going to call it, I'm just going to keep it as number1. And I'm going to assign it a value. I'm going to give it the value of 100. And notice how I'm not wrapping it in quotations like this. Because once I wrap any value, whether it's a number or a bunch of text, once I wrap this inside of double quotes, this attribute becomes a string. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of my double quotes, and I'm going to just write or type out 100. And I'm going to finish this off with a semicolon. and I'm going to create another variable here, also of type int, and I'm also going to keep it named number2, and let's say we'll keep it at 100 also. Actually, let's make things a little more interesting. Let's change that to 200. So now what happens when I print this out? So I'm taking number one, or my variable called number one, which is a value int, which is again holding the value of 100, and I'm adding to that number two, which is also of type int and a value of 200. If I run this, my result is 300, because now the plus sign recognizes that on both sides we're looking at int variables. We're not looking at strings. So now this plus sign acts the same way that the plus sign typically acts in your math class, right? So you have a number on one side and you want to add onto that another number on the other side. This value being 100 and this other value being 200, resulting in 300. So again, you can take this, you can copy it, and you can store it in a third variable, maybe call it the sum, and set that equal to number one plus number two. And then instead of having to type out number one plus number two in the print statement, you can simply call the sum variable, which already contains number one plus number two, and that'll give you the same result. All right. So you can also take two numbers and subtract them. So what you can do is take, let's actually keep it this way. So let's take number one and subtract number two from it. And we'll call this subtraction. Oops, let me stop that because I didn't replace this old variable with this one here. So I ran that. So I ran this code, and I had an error here. Whenever you get errors in any programming language, the errors look kind of ugly, so they're kind of scary to look at. They're hard to read too, but it's actually telling you exactly what's wrong with your program. So it tells you that in your main file, which is the file we're looking at right now, on line 9, there's an error here. So in this line of code, which is this one here, it's pointing right at your error, this here, the sum. In this snippet of code as is, there's no such thing as a variable called sum, because I changed the name from sum to subtraction. So now the variable sum doesn't exist anymore, and I'm trying to use it. So that's where the error is coming from. It cannot find the variable named sum because I changed the name from sum to subtraction. So what I'll do is I'll copy the new variable name and I'll replace sum in the print statement with subtraction. And I'll run that again, and that should resolve my error. So whenever you see errors in Java, don't freak out. Just read what it's telling you, and just look for whatever the error is and fix it. It's typically something really simple. So now what happened here? So what we did was we printed out the value of subtraction. We printed out the value of our attribute subtraction. And this variable, subtraction, is given the value of number one, which contains 100, minus number two, which contains 200. And of course, 100 minus 200 is equal to negative 100. So that means that negative 100 was stored into this variable. And now when we print it out, it contains the value negative 100. So mathematical operators work exactly the same way as they are intended to be used. So the plus sign adds two numbers together. The subtraction sign subtracts two numbers, and the / divides two numbers. So here, if I change, let's say, I change the attribute name to be, or the variable name to be division, and print this out. And let me actually divide number 2 by number 1, just to make this a little cleaner. So 200 divided by 100 will be what's stored in this variable here. And if I run that, I should get 2, because 200 divided by 100 is equal to 2. All right. So yeah, so those are ints in Java. We also have the ability of working with doubles in Java, and we'll take a look at that in the next video. But in case you're curious, what happens if we mix strings with numbers, or strings with ints? What happens then? Well, let's try it out. So I'm going to declare a new variable of type string. I'm going to call it my string. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing I was doing earlier with concatenating strings, except I'm going to add on to an integer variable a string variable, in this case, my string. So what happens here? So if I run this, it still works. It still concatenates things. So whenever you have a string and you're trying to add anything onto it, whether it's a string or a number, it will still concatenate them. And by concatenate, I just mean bring them together. So it'll take the value of division, which in my case was 2, right? Because 200 divided by 100 is equal to 2, which is stored here. It'll take 2, and it'll add to that the string my string, which it does right here. Okay. So the one thing you can't do, though, is, well, actually you can. So when you add a string onto any other data type, in this case, we're adding it onto an integer, the totality of this, what's resulting is this, right? And this is a string. This is considered a string. So what you can do is you actually can store this into another variable. The thing is, it has to be a variable of type string, because again, this resulting string is a string. So what I can do is replace all this stuff here and add my concatenated variable into the print statement, and that would be printed out exactly the same way it was earlier. So next up, we'll take a look at doubles. They are also a numerical representation of a value, except instead of them being whole values like integers, like 100 or 200 or 340 or 400, they are numerical values. So maybe like 400 and 340.45 or 56.3 or 200.4 or 100.5. So any value that contains a decimal is not an integer, it's a double. And we'll take a look at that in the next section.